I'm joined today from Los Angeles by Préity Üupala. Hello, Préity.
Namaste, Robert, and
Namaste.
namaste to all your wonderful viewers. It's such an honor to be on your show. I'm pleased to be on your show to talk about the fascinating topics that we're about to touch on.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you here for sure. And we're going to be talking about some topics we've been covering before, and that, of course, is globalism, China, the World Health Organization, not necessarily in that order, however. And we at here at Just Right Media have been covering these topics, especially globalism, since we first interviewed Christopher Monckton back in 2012. I don't know if you're familiar with Lord Christopher Monckton. No, it was more of a topic about climate change. However, he was very well versed in globalism. And back then, the objective was to cover Agenda 21 from the United Nations. And since then, we've dealt with Agenda 2030, and we've had several interviews with Professor Salim Mansour on that subject. And our viewers can visit justrightmedia.org to find our many videos and radio shows on the subject of globalism. But before we get into our topics today, I'd like to ask you, Préity, could you let our viewers know a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, wonderful. Pleasure to be here. My name is Préity Üupala. I'm a former investment banker turned thought leader, multimedia personality, and Hollywood entrepreneur. I'm from Sydney, Australia originally, but I was born in Dubai, grew up in the Middle East, all around, and lived in Europe before my family immigrated to Australia. And that's where I did my education, my degree, and I worked in the corporate sector. But I gave that up because it just wasn't my dharma in life. And I won a scholarship to study in New York many years ago. And that's what brought me out here. So I call LA home. And I do many things here. I have quite an interesting life. I write for several outlets. I'm a geopolitical analyst. So I cover things like international affairs, conflict, counterterrorism, religion, and anything really with geopolitical strategy. And I speak around the world too on some of these topics, but also spirituality, because that's a personal passion of mine, and sort of Vedic philosophy and, yoga, dharma, purpose, all that wonderful stuff. But of late, I've been speaking on soft power and globalization and or more so the failures of that. I have my own radio show called The Eternal Hour. It's on iHeartRadio. I also have my own YouTube news channel called The Préity Experience. And I'm writing my first book, which should be coming out towards the end of the year, that I'm excited about. And I'm also a Dharma ambassador. Essentially, I write and speak on the topics of Dharma. And I'm a global citizen. I've been to almost 100 countries. So traveling is obviously my passion in life. And I've been very privileged to speak on various platforms such as the Women's Economic Forum, HORASIS, and sort of the WEF Davos style summits. And it's been quite an experience. I do consider myself a global citizen of the world. That's a personal perception of mine, but on the political arena, I sort of have very different views on some of these sort of socio-political concepts. And just honored to be here to share my views.
Well, that's interesting because it was your globe trotting that really struck me as something that could contribute to the discussion about globalism versus globalization. And I'd like to put forward perhaps some definitions, just to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to this discussion. For example, globalism I would define as a political ideology where nation states are subservient to a global authority, and that authority being, of course, the United Nations, with unqualified socialist policies. Now, globalization, on the other hand, is a phenomenon. It's not necessarily political ideology. It's a phenomenon as opposed to a political ideology of liberalization of movement, of people, of goods, of services, and of capital. And national borders and laws are still protected and obeyed under globalization. And I'd like your input, or at least your own personal views as to whether or not we're on the same page regarding these definitions.
Very well articulated. You are right. These two are different, as so many things. It seems to be about the semantics of it all. Like there's a big difference between immigrant and a migrant. There's no such thing as an illegal immigrant, because if you're uh, an immigrant, then you're legal, and if you're illegal, then you're not really an immigrant. But people seem to sort of get the two confused, and these words are just kind of bandied around very loosely in our discourse these days, and it happens definitely with this concept of globalism and globalization. Yes, so globalism is a sort of political system or concept, and I mean, EU would be a great example of globalism, because it's all these independent nation states that have come together, and they want to assume that they're under one, whether it's a set of laws or constitution. Now they want to merge the armies and the economies, but they're very different, and they don't always integrate well and assimilate well. They don't always have the same value structure, and that poses a great threat. The idea of multiculturalism and diversity is a beautiful one. And, over the history of our world, we've seen how rich and profound that's been to almost every country. And I think we are a better world today because of this richness. And you look at America, it's a melting pot, of culture, states, and concepts, and so on, which is wonderful. But you can't conflate that with migration as such. So I think people seem to be conflating it on both ends of the political spectrum, both the left and the right. So globalization is, again, yes, like as you mentioned, it's just a social concept that we are so much more similar than we are different. We stand to gain by learning from each other, by sharing, by integrating the best of each other's cultures as it should be. And in some ways, we are one big happy family. I think on a very spiritual level, we are definitely connected. There is this concept of oneness and interconnectedness that's at the very essence, I think, of humanity and the world at large. This is very true. But you have to be careful. You have to separate this beautiful spiritual notion and emotional notion with the political system as such, because I think to lump them all in one becomes very dangerous, and then they get hijacked by people who want to abuse and misuse this. Because I think people who genuinely believe in globalism, they are good, honest people. They just think that we ought to work together, and we are one anyway, and what's the need for borders and so on. They're coming from the right place, but the problem is these things get politicized, they get weaponized, and it doesn't go down too well, because not all the actors are fair or sort of sincere. You have a lot of bad actors out there who will use this beautiful concept for their own gain and to create divides. And sometimes it's very subversive. Like, I think it's happening in Europe. I'm sure you've noticed, in the pursuit of bringing in people from all over the world, these poor persecuted masses, which I think every country obviously has a responsibility to offer refuge to people genuinely persecuted. And every country signs up for it, including the United States. And people do take in, they have quotas, and these people who come in as, seeking refuge, they end up, contributing in a massive way. Um, I mean, even Steve Jobs is the original. He's a Syrian immigrant by all means, in terms of where he was. I mean, he was adopted, but that's his sort of ethnicity. So that's all beautiful. But you have to be careful when you bring in legislation, politics, and you have governments who want to use this sort of notion for their own gain. And we're finding a lot of this happen with the EU specifically. And the sad thing is that you speak to your average German or French sometimes, and they just don't. Or Scandinavian. They really don't see the problem. I think you have to kind of spell it out to them, or by the time they do wake up and smell the coffee, it's going to be too late because they don't realize that you need to be careful about who you bring in, intentions, values, how easily they want to be integrated, assimilated, and so on. So that's on a person-to-person level. But then when you open up your laws and borders in terms of trade and whatnot, then you're really getting very, very uh, kind of treading on dangerous territory there, I think, because not every country, again, has the same sort of moral compass and their intentions. We've seen what some nations want to do and some don't, and so you have to be careful. You need to separate the beautiful notion of this sort of connected world, and of course, technology is a great enabler in that, with a political system that has a lot of fault lines in it and is dangerous at best. And you need to treat it carefully and take the best of this concept without actually now putting it in policy, because I think that's where the problem is arising.
I don't know how familiar you are with Canadian politics, if at all. Have you ever
Very
been?
familiar. I have been to Canada. Uh, Funnily enough, I'm an Australian citizen, and when I applied for my green card, I believe, I had a situation where I really needed to go to Sydney, Australia, which is my hometown, to the U.S. consulate over there to have my interview with the people in the U.S. consulate there. That's the way you're supposed to do it. You should always go to your home consulate, and they'll have an interview, and then they'll deem you fit to be, to give you the green card approval or not. Now, I was in New York at the time, and I just didn't want to go back to Sydney. And I spoke to my lawyer, and he said, well, what you could do is you could ask other U.S. consulates if they would make an exception and uh, take your interview at their consulate. And it won't be an Australian one. It would either have to be a Mexican or a Canadian one, because those were the closest to me. And I took my chance and I sort of contacted all of these consulates. Actually, all of them agreed, but the one in Ottawa was the one that was quickest, and I ended up accepting it there. So I drove all the way to Ottawa in fall season from upstate New York, and I had my interview, and then 2 days later I was approved, and they gave me back my passport with my stamp on it. But I have this amazing experience of traveling all around the east coast of Canada during the fall season, which is just spectacular. And I went to Montreal and Quebec and, well, Niagara, of course, and Ontario, the Queen's, McGill and the Queen's, is it Queen University? Yeah, these gorgeous campuses. And I just thought, what a beautiful country with wonderful people, and just seemed like it was such a great place to live in. But that was a long time ago, and since then I've been following your domestic politics, including the elections and all of that good stuff. And it's very, very scary, let's say, what's going on there. And I don't even know if the good Canadians are noticing what's going on.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of them either do or they don't. And if they don't, it's a shame. If they do, it's downright terrible. Because we have a prime minister at the moment, Justin Trudeau, who has in the past said that he has a certain affection towards the communist China government because they can turn things around on a dime. Yeah, they certainly can. And he's also noted for wearing global citizen T-shirts. Now, here's the leader of a government, right? A nation unto itself, wearing a globalist citizen T-shirt saying that we are the first post-national state and that we have no core identity. Those are his words. We've covered it extensively.
Wow.
So we're dealing with this globalism issue I think, in Canada, much more so than you are in the United States or perhaps even in Australia. I watch Sky News Australia quite a bit, and I do love Australia as a nation and the way they handle things down there. And I think you're blessed with having Donald Trump as a president at the moment.
Yes.
But we here in Canada, unfortunately, are saddled with a globalist as a leader, even though he's only garnered less than 30% of the popular vote, his party. So I just wanted to ask you how familiar you were with it, because of how important it is, this particular issue is to us in Canada,
Yes.
if not just the world at large. You brought up Europe, and I think people in Malmo, Sweden, for example, or the no-go zones in Paris, or
Belgium.
yes, in Belgium, and for example in Tower Hamlets in London, England. All of those areas are feeling the brunt of a globalist agenda, which is, one can only assume, is designed to destroy Western culture, Western values. That's something that is very concerning to us here, at least a lot of people in this country. And now we've had, of course, a new political party arise, the People's Party of Canada, led by a Quebecer, Maxime Bernier, who's from an area, by the way, Beauce in Quebec, very close to where immigrants, illegal immigrants, by any definition, they just cross over what's called Roxham Road from Vermont into Quebec. And now we have a law that says you cannot claim refugee status from the United States because the United States is a free country. And yet we have these refugees come over from the United States, claim refugee status, and because they don't come across at a legitimate border, we have to deal with them in a separate way. They get money, they get housing, they get food, they get clothing, and then they just they disappear in the system.
Yes.
So this is a very near and dear issue to us in Canada, because some of these people have actively sought to behead our Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister, not this one.
Stephen Harper?
Yes, Stephen Harper.
I love Stephen Harper. I had a chance I met him this year in Delhi at a foreign policy summit called the Raisina Dialogues, and it's put on by the government of India, by the Ministry of External Affairs, and they basically have all the heads of states there from around the world. And Stephen Harper was actually one of the guest of honors, along with the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, I think, and I got to meet him. He's such a friend of India, and I think you guys were so lucky under his leadership, and I'm sure you're missing his guidance. Now, Canada interests me for more than one reason. One is, of course, as a neighbor, I'm noticing what's going on there. It's much scarier over there than it is here, because I think for some reason Americans do put their foot down. I mean, these are like, if they see something eroding their constitution or their liberties, they are very assertive about it, right? They're vocal, and they will the resistance will be felt. But Canadians are just so nice, and I think in their kind of egalitarian view of the world, a lot of things are kind of passing by like water under the bridge, and nobody even seems to want to talk about it. Now, the other issue, the reason why I'm so interested in Canadian politics is, of course, because of your NDP party and your leadership over there. And I think most Canadians don't realize that this person is banned by the state of India, right? Because, of course, you know about the Khalistani movement. These are Sikh separatists, and they are very antagonistic to the Indian state. And so if Justin Trudeau wants to have a good relationship with India, which is, the largest secular democracy in the world, and there's so many Indians over there in Canada, and they love and respect Canada, and they've been good citizens. And I think these two countries obviously ought to work together. The last thing you want to do is have some sort of Khalistani person as your one. Aren't they in an alliance coalition government with the
Yes.
NDP?
Yes,
That's
right now
very
the
scary.
Liberals have a minority government, the Conservatives are in the official opposition, and Jagmeet Singh of the NDP basically holds the balance of power, yes.
So that gives him this trump card, which is really scary because I think I feel sorry for like your good Canadians who don't understand the history of subcontinent, and it's very very complex and interesting. And these people came over decades ago, and a lot of them are very respectful and all that. But there is this thing called the Khalistani movement, which essentially they're Sikh people who don't want to be a part of the Indian state. And luckily, it's actually almost extinct in India itself. There is no Khalistani movement there, very, very little. But in Canada, I think it's really alive, and a little bit in the UK too. And they are creating all kinds of racial and communal tensions in a foreign country. Like, come on, this is Canada, for God's sake. You're all Canadian, right? Why are you bringing in politics of another nation into a place like Canada? You don't need to do that. And there's a rift there, I think, between Sikh community and let's say the Indian community, and then of course you have your Pakistani community. There's a lot going on that people don't know and don't want to talk about. And sadly, I think you find the Khalistanis in bed with some other forces that really want to weaken the Canadian state. And then, when you have Trudeau who wants to fill his cabinet with, half 50% people, the diversity quota. I think that's a beautiful thing, but I think you have to be very careful. You need to pick the right kind of diverse people, not people with these ideologies of separatism and all sorts of intentions that are very subversive. So unfortunately, he can't see it, and I see the problem getting a little worse there. So I did follow the elections, and I think Andrew Scheer came very close. Maybe if he had was willing to tie up with another party, he might have got the necessary numbers. I don't know if that was something that they wanted to do, but it was tight, which shows that there is a tide shifting in Canada clearly, or else it would have been lopsided in the favor of the Liberals. But it was pretty tight, right? I mean, could have kind of almost gone either way, but which actually is comforting, which means that people are waking up, and there are a lot of people disgruntled by what's going on.
Well,
What's the election? Yeah.
I don't really think that it is as close as you may have been led to believe,
Ah.
because even though Andrew Scheer of the Conservative Party held about 32 to 34% of the popular vote during coming into the election, at a time when we had one of the worst leaders of a Liberal Party in our history, I mean, claiming that we have no core identity, a dismal record as Prime Minister before the election, and the fact that the Conservatives couldn't push past that 34% means that they probably never will. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that the People's Party of Canada started up, was because the writing was on the wall that Conservatives could never, ever break that barrier and get back into the power that Stephen Harper had at one point. And by the way, Stephen Harper, while I think he was a good statesman and a good leader for Canada in some respects, we've covered it on the show before, he certainly wasn't what somebody might really call a conservative, perhaps down in the United States. Certainly not. I mean, he's not like a Republican conservative from Alabama, for sure.
Yeah.
Conservatives.
He has good foreign policy, and I think he was sound. His foreign policy was much more sound than what it is currently. And yeah, you're right. He's a statesman, very charismatic, very well liked and respected, I think, around the world, to be honest. So Canada had a great image, I think, under him. Now it's divided. There are some people who just love this Canadian model, and then there are all the other people who are like, what is going on? So it's like, it's so divided.
Well, the division is much like in the United States. You have your flyover states and you have your eastern and western seaboards with diametrically opposed views, Democrat versus Republican. Here in Canada, the Liberal NDP base is all urban. more or less, I would say, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. Those are all, here we call them red. In the States, it's red for Republican. Here, red is red.
Ah,
Liberal red. And it's very urban, rural here. And you can go out into, just once you get outside the cities, Canada is a different place, believe me. Let's move along, Preeti, to another issue, and that would be
yes.
China. Because China, most recently with Hong
Oh,
Kong, has flexed its muscles and has basically all but put down any of the protests there. And also their hold on the World Health Organization and the influence that it's held regarding how the latest health crisis has been handled by the world. What are your views on communist China's hold over
mhm.
basically every issue in the world at the moment?
That's true. I think few things that this pandemic has unveiled is that number one, economy isn't the most important criteria when you look at a superpower or an emerging power. I think before this pandemic, there always used to be debates on is it going to be India or China that's going to be the next sort of superpower. And a lot of people, I'm sure they would say China because it does have the bigger economy and it has industrialized already. Um, and I think post a pandemic, I think people are really looking at this whole thing very different because the one thing that they didn't factor in was morality and values and how responsible uh, the state is, in terms of its own citizens, but also the rest of the world. What kind of a power is China going to be, and what kind of a power would India be? And it's huge. It's like night and day. So I think there's so many positives that came out of this pandemic, and that's one of them. The other one, I think we all realized how entrenched China is in the global economy itself, right? I mean, you're right. They sort of are so intertwined with so many global economies that it is so difficult for people to just cut cords and walk away. We've uh, seen that this whole global experiment, I mean, this whole globalization or globalism, I should say, and multilateralism has failed. That's been the biggest fault line, right? I think the pandemic has shown that there's serious fault lines in this concept. And I think if it wasn't for this pandemic, we would just be, we would have kept going. We would have doubled down on it, even open up even more, sort of converge even more. And now everybody's just taken a step back and sort of halted. Now, with the WHO, people don't realize that China actually really supported this, the executive chairman, who's Ethiopian, who happened to, was a member of the Ethiopian Communist Party, right, in his country, who have a terrible human rights record. And they've been known for all sorts of bad things in their own country. And he's certainly a very communist in his worldview. And China really propped him up, and they supported him. He was obviously elected. I think before this pandemic, people didn't really know much about him, but now everybody does, and it showed how in bed they were in terms of these, um, whether it was just trying to propagate communist ideologies or worse, to aid China in their, this imperialistic strategy to sort of be the king of the world in so many ways. And I'm sure you've heard of the BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. That has been having a lot of cracks, of late. So that's not something that I think China can count on anymore, at least not in the subcontinent area. The CPEC and all that kind of stuff is just not feasible. So China's, their long-term strategy always has been how do we dominate the world? How do we topple the US? How do we become the number one economy, PPP as well as GDP, and just at large? And sort of this pandemic almost, I think it kind of served their purpose, but and then some. I think to a point though where they've been actually been hurt in terms of brand China. I think their plans are kind of unveiled now because before this pandemic, I think there were a few countries obviously very concerned, but now everybody's concerned of everything, their grand plans, their eating habits, people's human rights, liberties, their processes, and all of these things, and how entrenched they are, not just with the WHO, but also the UN, also international institutions. And I think the international institutions are at threat in so many levels. And I think that's one of the other problems that sort of been kind of there's been a spotlight shed on it, that our international institutions are very fragile, and we have to be very careful and do what we need to do. So with I'm actually very happy to say that just a few days ago there was the meeting of all the nations, and there was a unanimous vote. Now India's taken over the executive chairmanship of the WHO. So I am proud to say that I think the world is going to be in safer hands than it has been. And the person who I guess replaces Tedros is Dr. Harshvardhan, who's an actual medical doctor.
An actual doctor.
An actual doctor for a change, heading the World Health Organization, for God's sake. And he is a loved and respected politician. He's a seasoned politician. He's a part of the ruling party in India. He's also, I think, the science and technology minister in India. So he's got his hands full. I think his work is cut out with him, because he's not only, the science and technology minister for, I think, 1.3 billion people, but now this chairmanship of the WHO, and they take over from at a time where things are really fragile. But I think this is a great opportunity for India to step up to the plate and show the world what they're capable of, because the potential is there, the capability is there. I think we've seen in sort of bits and pieces how really they can be a global leader in so many ways. But this is an opportunity for them where I think everybody else is vulnerable and failing, where they really can step up. They are in a very stable position to do that, because the situation back home is actually quite good. This pandemic has not affected people in terms of death, fatalities, and so on. So, an economy, of course, it's been hit, but they don't have that added pressure of now loss of life as well as the loss of economy, as we have seen in the U.S. The U.S. is extremely weakened and kind of really it's shambolic, to be honest, what's going on here. But so there's always a silver lining. I think it's time for India to maybe take a greater role. It's for the taking. China does not need to be so entrenched. There are other great powers that can take a little bit of that, but they have to step up to the plate. It's not easy, but I think if there was any time where a country like India would have backing of Australia, of the US, of Japan, and some other great nations, this would be the time. The Quad, and there's many like the G20 or the G7 would really back India, I think, to take a more international leadership role, so to speak, and especially with the health thing, because I think we have it under control in our own nation in some ways. So, it's a mixed bag. It's been atrocious what has happened in the last few months, I think, with the WHO. But I think the better days are ahead of us.
And especially with, I think, Donald Trump as president of the United States, matched with Modi in India, who's a well-respected leader in his own right. And of course, we all saw that spectacle when Trump visited India. That was quite something to see the love between those two. Yeah. Now,
sorry, go ahead. I always say that it's so, regardless of what you think about, President of the US or the Prime Minister of India, people have their own perceptions. Whatever that may be, these two nations need to work together. It doesn't help anyone for them to be adversarial to each other. There's only three powers. It's India, China, and the US. And I think two of these really should be working together, considering if you do want to kind of dismantle China, the US cannot do it on its own. It needs another aid. And the only ally in that region is India. And I think India in the next sort of 50 years is going to be the great emerging power and it's been like the hidden dragon in many ways. But that's okay. I think it's all timing, and it has its own sort of karmic story, and I think it's on its way up. I think back to its old glory that it had like 4,000 years ago. Uh, People don't realize that it was like one of the most prosperous countries between India and China for 4,000 years. It was either or, and then of course they had their own issues, implosions, and then we had the 1,000 year of invasions that really sort of weakened us and bankrupt us as a nation. And then of course we got the independence, and now we're kind of rising up. But I think in 70 years it's done incredibly well. We had 60 years of socialism slash communism, which didn't help. It's only in the last few decades that we had economic reforms and became a truly sort of open market capitalistic society, and with proper guidance, vision, and leadership now, that I think it can see it through the next few decades. So I'm excited, and it's nice to see Modi get along with. I mean, I think he would get along with whoever ends up winning. He's had good relationships with everybody, even Justin Trudeau to some extent. I mean, he just puts on the act at least. But I do see a stronger, tighter alliance between the U.S. and India, and I am someone who really pushes and advocates for that because I think it's better for them and it's better for the whole world actually for them to kind of work together.
I certainly agree. I certainly agree. Do you think perhaps this pandemic has done China a disservice in one respect? Is that now all eyes are on China, and in your home country of Australia, they're thinking of actually getting out of the Port of Darwin expansion that the Chinese government has invested in, because for security reasons, China has become a question in the mind of security regarding Western nations. What are your thoughts on that?
I must say, as proud as I am of Prime Minister Modi, I'm equally proud of Prime Minister Scott Morrison. I think he has really stepped up. I think the Liberal government in Australia has been so pragmatic and kind of very. It's a well thought out sort of stance that they've taken, but they've I believe they've banned 5G from China into Australia, which is a first great step. But they are seriously taking the fight to China in terms of putting their step down, questioning. They're almost leading this big, yeah, I don't know whether you want to call it a global investigation of sorts, but and they're garnering support from all the other great democracies in the world and other emerging powers. So good on Scott Morrison for doing that. I think Australians ought to be very proud of him. He's had a tough year with the fires first and then this. And although Australia has not been hurt again in terms of fatalities, I think they've done a fantastic job of containing it very, very early on. Very, very tough quarantine situation. But then Australia has always been a tough quarantine situation because it's an island continent and they can't risk whether they're very. It's funny they're not concerned about illegal immigrants as much as they are about foods and exotic seeds and things that come from overseas, because that actually can contaminate the country more than people can. And they've always been so tough with their quarantine policies, and now they're really kind of under serious lockdown. I think they'll open up soon. They haven't already. So no, good for him for doing that. And I was researching some of the legal kind of stands for countries taking legal action against the CCP. Uh, Sadly, if you listen to legal experts and legal professors on these matters, it's not great news, because I know there's so much anger and frustration. I know we want to hold someone accountable. I think atonement needs to be had. I think for the world, we want there needs to be some resolve of what has happened, because it seems like if we don't, that somebody was able to tinker with the world and get away with it. And I don't think we want to feel that that's happened in the world that we live in. But if you speak to the legal experts, I did some research last night actually, and I realized that uh, U.S. Has a legal immunity in international courts, but also foreign countries also enjoy legal immunity in the U.S., which is, I understand the reason for that, but in layman's terms, uh, I know there are Americans out here who want to, start these class action suits against the CCP. It's actually legally not really feasible because the jurisprudence and the jurisdiction does not kind of support that. So I mean, you could try, but it won't stand, because of the impunities or immunities that they have. So sadly, we have to contend with the fact that legally perhaps we will never be able to hold anybody accountable, and also then comes the big issue of how do you prove, right, that there was malice on their part, because it's a very nebulous situation. I'm sure a lot of people know kind of what happened or the intentions behind what happened, but to prove that in court is very, very dicey, and it won't stand, I think, legal scrutiny, sadly, based on the way that this sort of legal system actually works, whether it's the ICC or the ICJ. Um, so that's unfortunate. But I think what the U.S. can do, and I think they're talking about it, but sanctions, fines, or hurt sort of China in other ways. Even just for the fact that they were just reckless about letting the world know so late. Even if it was a mistake, whatever. Even if this pandemic, whatever. Whoever, we'll never know the real truth. But they put a lid on it. They were not transparent to the point that they could have been, and that actually did a lot of damage. So just from that point alone, uh, I think there are things that the great democracies in the world can do. I don't know. I'm not seeing any action yet, but let's see. I think when things simmer down, we'll have to see who really steps up to the plate.
Yeah, if I could turn perhaps even to a personal note, if you don't mind, and that would be that you're born in Dubai, you're an Australian citizen living in the United States, and yet I've watched a number of your videos on other channels, and I see that everything seems to come back to India.
Yes.
Is that what you would call your ethnicity, your roots, your heritage?
That's a very, very good point. And I wasn't always like that. I've actually never lived in India. And so I always grew up, around the world. And I think, quite frankly, living in the Middle East uh, really affected me in many ways, many positive ways, I would say, because there are a lot of positive things growing up there, especially in a country like Dubai, which is very wealthy and very modern and luxurious in many ways. So you see the good, bad, and the ugly. I always take the good from every culture or every country that I've lived in or been to. So there was a lot that affected me. And then, of course, Europe and Australia. In many ways, I think like an Australian, which is great because they're so open and easygoing and level-headed, down to earth, which is very, very appealing, I think, and sort of helps in diplomacy. Uh, but I think in terms of uh, political, because India becomes a very interesting case study, I think, because it's gone through so many different political kind of churn in a way, and you can almost look at what has happened in India, and then kind of it should be a warning for the rest of the world. And I think the U.S. hasn't gone through that phase yet. So I that's one reason, because it's a very politically it's very, very interesting, and there's a lot of people who study India and Indian history, whether it's civilizational history or it's just political history post independence. It's so layered, and there's so many lessons to learn, I think, for the world. And in India, it's the largest secular country in the world. So it's a very interesting experiment where it's Hindu majority. However, it also has the second largest Muslim population in the world, and it has every other faith there. So extremely diverse, but you see all the good and you see all the bad as well. And there are things that people don't want to talk about, whether it's demography or communal tensions, and or some communities kind of pumping things up and it's like the I think the essential ethos of India is very Hindu, right? It's been for 6,000 years or more probably, and that's the reason why it is open, tolerant, pluralistic, accepting, syncretic of all other cultures and faiths, and that's what makes India what it is today. But you look at other faiths, other ideologies, it's not the same, and we see some serious, I think, friction in India on this very issue that that Western media doesn't talk about, and people, the so-called secular, liberals in India don't want to be honest about, but they have to, or else it'll be too late. And it seems like all this bad, uh, you know, headlines that we're getting out of India, they're actually coming from a different place altogether. But going back to your question, I think yes, my ethnicity, of course, is Indian. But I think the more spiritual I get, the more intertwined I get with my own spirituality, which is very Indian and very Indic, Vedic, let's say. I think I have a greater appreciation for civilizational history of India. I think, and I'm proud of that more than the India that we see today. I think my pride and my connection is really with the essence of India in that way. And you meet a lot of Indians that do share that sentiment with me. They have an immense pride of what sort of this, uh, whether it's an ancient wisdom tradition you want to call it, or whatever this essence of this nation that India has sort of endured for thousands of years amongst all kinds of invasions and so on, and it still remains intact, is pretty phenomenal considering so many other ideologies were wiped out when they were sort of invaded and so on. But the fact that we see the India that we see today is beautiful, and I think that keeps me going back home. And I always say I'm a very proud Australian citizen. I'm honored to live in America. I'm proud of my American residence, but my spirituality and my essence is Indian, and I'm also very proud of that. I think Thomas Friedman made a great point recently. He gave an interview and he said the world would be a very different place if India wasn't India, if it was an Iraq or a Syria or Pakistan even. Imagine a country of that size and that complex nature. If sort of the makeup or the mindset was different, I think it would be quite frankly the most dangerous country in the world, and it would really be very, very bad for the region and the world at large. So I think he was expressing gratitude that India is what it is today. So he said it in so many words, and I'm a big fan of his sort of how he looks at he also talks about globalism and globalization, but I think he's a bit more nuanced in his kind of narrative. So yeah, and I think moving forward, all of these great ideologies are going to there's going to be more convergence and more sharing and learning. We'll take a lot from the East and we'll take the best from the West too.
Well, Préity, I do appreciate you coming on our channel and sharing your vast experience with global affairs with our viewers, and I wish you well, and I hope you can come back again soon.
Absolutely. I'm honored to have been on your show. Thank you for having me. Love to come back and talk about more scintillating political and I guess the social issues. So thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you.